Columbia hosted. Before we begin with opening remarks from Nita Nuki Kui, Dr. Christy Brissett, and a blessing from Kuwasa Nahawi, Amanda Kennedy, I will have a few housekeeping items to share with you. First, keep your video and mic turned off during the event. Only those who are reading a call will turn their video and mic on when it is their turn to read a call. Second, we want to respect everyone's time and know that it is a challenging time of year, particularly due to the new COVID variant. If tonight's event goes beyond 8:30 and you need to go, you are welcome to log off. We hope that you will be able to stay for the event in its entirety. Finally, if you have any technical questions, please post them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. The chat function will not be functional for most of the event, other than when a link that corresponds with a specific call is posted in the chat, and when we have some time after the calls are read for a short time of reflection and intention. Thank you for your patience, for your participation, for your willingness to learn, seek truth, and work toward reconciliation with our Indigenous neighbors and communities. Dr. Allison Larkin, Chair of the Department of Social Justice and Peace Studies at King's University College, will give us a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Carla. The Honorable Murray Sinclair, Chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, calls on Canadians who are not Indigenous to understand that they too are victims of this history. He wants non-Indigenous people to understand that the Indigenous community does not need settlers to help heal them. They need to fix themselves. In his words, we need you to get those people out there who are perpetrating this process of working against reconciliation under control. We need you to straighten yourselves out. We don't need you to just step forward and say, well, here is what we can do for you. Because my question is always, what are you doing for yourself? What are you doing to get rid of that violent vocal force that is holding us all back, holding this country back? Because that is what is going to stop reconciliation. In this spirit of commitment to truth-seeking and reconciliation, we acknowledge that Western University and King's University College are located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chonongton nations, on lands connected with the London Township and Sambre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, endure in Canada. And we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. I'd now like to introduce to you Dr. Nita Nuki Kui, Christy Brissett. She is Anishinaabe from Kettle and Stony Point First Nation and is the Vice Provost and Associate Vice President of Indigenous Initiatives at Western University. Thank you, Dr. Brissett.
Oh, thank you, Miigwech. So happy to be here tonight. I want to introduce myself, Neta Noki Kwe. That is Anishinaabe-Moan, Ojibwe language for my name, which is hardworking woman. And my other name is Christy Brissett, and I'm from Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. So Kiko Nan Dunjibra, I'm from Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. And my clan is Turtle, so Mijikan Dodem. And I am an Anishinaabe woman, so Anishinaabe Kwe Endau. So very happy to be here and supporting this very important event. I'm joining you with great honor as the Western's inaugural Vice Provost and Associate Vice President for Indigenous Initiatives. So I really want to thank everyone at King's University College for organizing this event. I'm very honored and very pleased to participate. So I wanted to start by saying that for many Indigenous peoples across many different nations and cultures, the winter solstice, which is going to be next week, December 21st, is usually at the time, it is not usually, it's the darkest time of the year. And that provides an opportunity to really reflect inward with intentionality as we care for ourselves, which also includes our spirit, our bodies, our mind, and also our loved ones and our families. It's within this time of reflection where we tell stories, where we rest, and where we actively prepare for the long days ahead. I think about how in this month, in this season, this upcoming winter season, the time of stories, the winter solstice, is a perfect time for us to be reflecting on where we are at in this country in terms of the work of reconciliation. As part of my reflections that I engage with in the past, I often look at my own healing journey. As I come from a family that has experienced many violence and neglect, oppression, and abuse due to the Indian Act under the colonial government of Canada. Myself, I am a survivor of intergenerational residential schools. My grandmother went to the Mush Hole, which is also known as the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, and my uncles and cousins went to the Mount Elgin Industrial School, which is only 15 to 20 minutes outside of London. So I live with those realities, the intergenerational impact of the oppression that as an Indigenous person we face every day in this country. I am hopeful when I think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings, which were conclusive that Canada is guilty of genocide against its original inhabitants who have been here since time immemorial. And while that's a reality, I am also very hopeful that as we come together, Indigenous peoples and allies, and as we recognize, observe, and implement the 94 calls to action, this will provide a way for us to decolonize ourselves, our minds, our society, and our institutions, and then indigenize those on a path forward towards reconciliation. Reconciliation is urgently needed between all peoples, and especially with the earth. And observing the calls for action within the TRC is an excellent way of starting that work. At Western, Western itself has embraced the calls to actions, as have many other Canadian universities, and we will continue to implement this work within various strategic plans. So by engaging in these important activities like we are this evening, taking time to reflect on these calls to actions and actively planning on how we implement, this is a way that we can renew our commitment to each other and to increase Indigenous voices and presence across all levels of our community, work, study, and research. So Chimigwech, thank you all so very much for your time tonight as we use this opportunity to reflect on the 94 calls to action. Miigwech.
Chimigwech, Nidanuki Kui, for your opening message. I have the honor of introducing my Indigenous mentor and friend, Gwasawahani, Amanda Kennedy. Gwasawahani is Haudenosaunee Bear Clan from Oneida Nation of the Thames and is an Indigenous woman innovator, community activist, economic developer, advocate, business coach, and mentor for Indigenous youth, women, and men.
Sagoli, Gawasanahawi Youngats, Onya Da'aga Wakwali. My gifted English name is Amanda Kennedy, and my gifted spirit name is Gawasanahawi. It means a name carry for her. I'm Haudenosaunee from Oneida First Nations of the Thames, Ona Da'aga, and I'm Bear Clan Okwali. I am the granddaughter of residential school survivors, and I'm an Indigenous woman knowledge keeper. Learning can be good, but it can be hard, and we need to take care of ourselves through these times. And it's an honor to be here today to open up this space in a good way so that we can learn, heal, and grow together. Everyone has a lot going on, and when we come into this space to learn and talk about such serious issues, we need to have clear minds and ground ourselves so that we can be present and aware. It's not easy learning the truth, and I'm very proud of all of you for stepping out of your comfort zone. You're all taking action, and this is amazing to be witnessing. In the Haudenosaunee tradition, it teaches us that pieces requires gratitude. And we are here to be thankful for Mother Earth and for all living creation and all the blessings that we receive. Our relationship to the earth is the basis of our roots and of our peacefulness. Our Mother Earth connects us to a beautiful process of creation, and she continues to provide us with all we need to be happy, healthy, and to thrive. To this day, nearly every social, cultural, and political event that takes place within the Haudenosaunee nations begins and ends with a Thanksgiving address. Through these words, our minds are gathered together to share our thankfulness of what nature provides and acknowledges the ongoing impact of these forces on human lives. The Thanksgiving address acknowledges the people, earth, waters, plants, animals, birds, trees, wind, sun, moon, and more, as well as the unseen spiritual forces. There's so many connections between human beings and other living beings in the world, and the Haudenosaunee people are thankful for all the connections and gifts that we receive. So I'm going to do an opening prayer and a grounding, and in part of this, I'm going to ask you to breathe. And I'm going to ask you to take a breath in, and then I'm going to say something, and I'm going to tell you to hold it, and then I'll say something else, and then I'm going to tell you to breathe out and let go. So I'm just giving you that heads up so you're aware. So I ask all that you who can to please bow their heads in humility and respect as we open up this space to listen and learn, to acknowledge and appreciate. I would like to make space and take a moment to acknowledge and give thanks to the land that we stand on, live off, and thrive off today. I would like to make space and take a moment to acknowledge and give thanks to Mother Earth, who continues to take care of all of us and who continues to provide for all of us. I invite you all into this sacred space and ask my ancestors, spirit guides, guardian angels to join us as we give thanks and appreciation. And I'll ask everyone, please take a deep breath in, breathing in, grounding yourself in this moment. We hold it in our hearts, our spirits, in our minds. And then now slowly breathe out, letting go what we cannot control. Again, please take another deep breath in, breathing in, grounding yourself in this moment. We hold it in our hearts, our spirits, and our minds. And now slowly breathe out, letting go what we cannot control. Together, we gather our minds as one and give love and acknowledge my ancestors who fought hard and prayed hard for us all to be here. Together, we gather our minds as one and give love and acknowledge all the children who attended Indian residential schools. Together, we gather our minds as one and give love and acknowledge all the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, people, and their families and communities. Together, we gather our minds as one and give love and appreciation to the trees, especially the leader of the tree, the maple tree. Together, we gather our minds as one and give love and appreciation to the plants and the medicines, and acknowledging the four sacred medicines: sage, sweetgrass, tobacco, and cedar. Together, we gather our minds as one and give love and appreciation to the land animals, water animals, and sky animals. Together, we gather our minds as one and give love and appreciation to the four seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter. Together, we gather our minds as one and give love and appreciation to Brother Sun and Grandmother Moon. Together, we gather our minds as one and give love and appreciation to the water, for water is life. Together, we gather our minds as one and give love and appreciation to all the readers, listeners, and learners who are here today to learn and how to take action, how to learn more truth, and how to learn together how we can work towards reconciliation. Together, we gather our minds as one and give love and appreciation to those who organized this event and brought us all together so that we can listen, learn, and grow together. Now I ask, please take another deep breath in, breathing in this moment, breathing in all this good energy, grounding ourselves in this moment. We hold it in our hearts, our spirits, and our minds. Now slowly breathe out, letting go of what we cannot control. One more time, please take a deep breath in, breathing in, grounding yourself again in this moment. We hold it in our hearts, our spirits, and our minds. And now slowly tilt your head back, breathing out, letting go of what we cannot control. I'm grateful to be invited to this space to do this grounding. Yonko, thank you. Good.
Yoko Kwasanahawi for that beautiful blessing. That was very moving, and thank you very much. Just before we move on to the calls, I just want to let you know that Corey has let me know that there is a limit of 100 panelists. So right now, some of the readers cannot come in because we are at our limit. So once you have read a call, you will be then being changed to an attendee so that other panelists can come in. We will now begin to read the calls. We will introduce the reader for each call. When you hear your name, please unmute yourself and turn your video on. Read the call, then mute yourself and turn your video off again. In order to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission makes the following calls to action.
We call on reader number 1, Zai.
We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to commit to reducing the number of Aboriginal children in care by monitoring and assessing neglect investigations, providing adequate resources to enable Aboriginal communities and child welfare organizations to keep Aboriginal families together where it is safe to do so, and to keep children in culturally appropriate environments regardless of where they reside. Ensuring that social workers and others who conduct child welfare investigations are properly educated and trained about the history and impacts of residential schools. Ensuring that social workers and others who conduct child welfare investigations are properly educated and trained about the potential for Aboriginal communities and families to provide more appropriate solutions to family healing. Requiring that all child welfare decision makers consider the impact of residential school experience on children and their caregivers.
We call on reader number 2, Clairegate.
We call upon the federal government, in collaboration with the provinces and territories, to prepare and publish annual reports on the number of Aboriginal children, First Nations and Inuit and Métis, who are in care compared with non-Aboriginal children, as well as the reasons for apprehension, the total spending on preventive and care services by child welfare agencies, and the effectiveness of various interventions.
We call on reader number 3, Giacetta Newman.
We call upon all levels of government to fully implement Jordan's principle.
We call on reader number 4, Isla.
We call upon the federal government to enact Aboriginal child welfare legislation that establishes national standards for Aboriginal child apprehension and custody cases that includes principles that 1. Affirm the right of Aboriginal governments to establish and maintain their own child welfare agencies. 2. Require all child welfare agencies and courts to take the residential school legacy into account in their decision making. And 3, establish as an important priority a requirement that placements of Aboriginal child into temporary and permanent care by culturally appropriate.
We call on caller number 5, Cassandra Dawson.
We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to develop culturally appropriate parenting programs for Aboriginal families.
We call on caller number 6, Linda Baldwin.
We call upon the government of Canada to repeal Section 43 of the Criminal Code of Canada.
We call on caller number 7, Tom Mallison.
We call upon the federal government to develop with Aboriginal groups a joint strategy to eliminate educational and employment gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians.
We call on caller number 8, Fia.
We call upon the federal government to eliminate the discrepancy in federal education funding for First Nations children being educated on reserves and those First Nations children being educated off reserves.
We call on caller number 9, Shauna Lukowitz.
We call upon the federal government to prepare and publish annual reports comparing funding for the education of First Nations children on and off reserves, as well as educational and income attainments of Aboriginal peoples in Canada compared with non-Aboriginal people.
We call on caller number 10, Terence Kenon.
We call on the federal government to draft new Aboriginal education legislation with the full participation and informed consent of Aboriginal peoples. The new legislation would include a commitment to sufficient funding and would incorporate the following principles. 1, providing sufficient funding to close identified educational achievement gaps within one generation. 2, improving education attainment levels and success rates. 3, developing culturally appropriate curricula. 4, protecting the right to Aboriginal languages, including the teaching of Aboriginal languages as credit courses. 5, enabling parental and community responsibility, control, and accountability, similar to what parents enjoy in public school systems. 6, enabling parents to fully participate in the education of their children. And 7, respecting and honoring treaty relationships.
We call on caller number 11, Tracy Cunningham.
We call upon the federal government to provide adequate funding to end the backlog of First Nation students seeking a post-secondary education.
We call on caller number 12, Deborah Crow.
We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to develop culturally appropriate early childhood education programs for Aboriginal families.
We call on caller 13, Anne-Marie DeSico Best.
We call upon the federal government to acknowledge that Aboriginal rights include Aboriginal language rights.
We call on caller number 14, Alicia Artoon.
Anton. Golis wagweg Alicia Niyunget Hosluni Gene Yoda Halote Yunget Hungwe Huene Hogwali Niwagi Dalota Onyeta Ak Niwagu Hujod Lodi no Suni people is where I'm from. Gaye Yuan, number 14. We call upon the federal government to enact an Aboriginal Languages Act that incorporates the following principles. Huska, number 1. Aboriginal languages are a fundamental and valued element of Canadian culture and society, and there is an urgency to preserve them. Dignity, number 2. Aboriginal language rights are reinforced by the treaties. Pasta, number 3. The federal government has a responsibility to provide sufficient funds for Aboriginal language revitalization and preservation. Gaye, number 4. The preservation, revitalization, and strengthening of Aboriginal languages and cultures are best managed by Aboriginal people and communities. Whisk, number 5. Funding for Aboriginal language initiatives must reflect the diversity of Aboriginal languages.
We call on caller number 15, David Heap.
We call upon the federal government to appoint, in consultation with Aboriginal groups, an Aboriginal Languages Commissioner. The Commissioner should help promote Aboriginal languages and report on the adequacy of federal funding of Aboriginal languages initiatives.
We call on caller number 16, Laura Gribble.
We call upon post-secondary institutions to create university and college degree and diploma programs in Aboriginal languages.
We call on caller number 17, we call on caller number 17, Kate Gianapolis.
We call upon all levels of government to enable residential school survivors and their families to reclaim names changed by the residential school system by waiving administrative costs for a period of 5 years for the name change process and the revision of official identity documents, such as birth certificates, passports, driver's licenses, health cards, status cards, and social insurance numbers.
We call on caller number 18, Finlay.
We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to acknowledge that the current state of Aboriginal health in Canada is a direct result of previous Canadian government policies, including the residential schools, and to recognize and implement the healthcare rights of the Aboriginal people as identified in the international law, constitutional law, and under the treaties.
We call on caller number 21, Charisse Lynn Curtis. I apologize, I have messed that up. We call on caller number 19, Ardith Bershikin.
We call upon the federal government in consultation with Aboriginal peoples to establish measurable goals to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities, and to publish annual progress reports and assess long-term trends. Such efforts would focus on indicators such as infant mortality, maternal health, suicide, mental health, addictions, life expectancy, birth rates, infant and child health issues, chronic diseases, illness and injury incidents, and the availability of appropriate health services.
We call on caller number 20, Lori Burskin.
In order to address the jurisdictional disputes concerning Aboriginal people who do not reside on reserves, we call upon the federal government to recognize, respect, and address the distinct health needs of the Métis, Inuit, and off-reserve Aboriginal peoples.
We call on caller number 21, Charisse Lynn Curtis.
We call upon the federal government to provide sustainable funding for existing and new Aboriginal healing centers to address the physical, mental, and emotional and spiritual harms caused by residential schools, and to ensure that the funding of the healing centers in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories is a priority.
We call on caller number 22, Lisa Jackson.
Sagoli, yendo got sleo ni on get sakwali ni no get the lodo and the akni wago jodo.
They wasn't digging 22. We call upon those who can affect change within the Canadian healthcare system to recognize the value of Aboriginal healing practices and use them in the treatment of Aboriginal patients in collaboration with Aboriginal healers and elders where requested by Aboriginal patients.
We call on caller number 23, Pamela Cushing.
We call upon all levels of government to increase the number of Aboriginal professionals working in the healthcare field, ensure the retention of Aboriginal healthcare providers in Aboriginal communities, and provide cultural competency training for all healthcare professionals.
We call on caller number 24, Scott Charisse.
We call upon medical and nursing schools in Canada to require all students to take a course dealing with Aboriginal health issues, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, and Indigenous teachings and practices. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism.
We call on caller number 25, Holly.
We call upon the federal government to establish a written policy that reaffirms the independence of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to investigate crimes in which the government has its own interest as a potential or a real party in civil litigation.
We call upon caller number 26, Rain.
We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to review and amend their respective statutes of limitations to ensure that they conform to the principle that governments and other entities cannot rely on limitation defenses to defend legal actions of historical abuse brought by Aboriginal people.
We call upon caller number 27, Bronnie Morgan.
We call upon the Federation of Law Societies of Canada to ensure that lawyers receive appropriate cultural competency training, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism.
We call upon caller number 28, Lisa McClim.
We call upon law schools in Canada to require all law students to take a course in Aboriginal people in the law, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skill-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism.
We call upon caller number 29, Ariel Kayabaga.
We call upon the parties, and in particular, the federal government, to work collaboratively with plaintiffs not included in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement to have disputed legal issues determined expeditiously on an agreed set of facts.
We call upon caller number 30, Najia Mahmood.
We call upon federal, provincial, and territorial governments to commit to eliminating the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody over the next decade, and to issue detailed annual reports that monitor and evaluate progress in doing so.
We call on caller number 31, Miriam Hamu.
We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to provide sufficient and stable funding to implement and evaluate community sanctions that will provide realistic alternatives to imprisonment for Aboriginal offenders and respond to the underlying causes of offending.
We call on caller number 32, Ezra Ari.
We call upon the federal government to amend the criminal code to allow trial judges, upon giving reasons, to depart from mandatory minimum sentences and restrictions on the use of conditional sentences.
We call on caller number 33, Kristen Uzanski.
We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to recognize as a high priority the need to address and prevent fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and to develop, in collaboration with Aboriginal people, FASD preventative programs that can be delivered in a culturally appropriate manner.
We call on caller number 34, Irene Matheson.
We call upon the governments of Canada, the provinces, and territories to undertake reforms to the criminal justice system to better address the needs of offenders with fetal alcohol syndrome spectrum disorder, including providing increased community resources and powers for courts to ensure that FASD is properly diagnosed and that appropriate community supports are in place for those with FASD. 2, enacting statutory exemptions from mandatory minimum sentences of imprisonment for offenders affected by FASD. 3, providing community, correctional, and parole resources to maximize the ability of people with FASD to live in the community. 4, adopting appropriate evaluation mechanisms to measure the effectiveness of such programs and ensure community safety.
We call on caller number 35, Siddharth Mazawari.
We call upon the federal government to eliminate barriers to the creation of additional Aboriginal healing lodges with the federal correctional system.
We call on caller number 36, Robin Hurley.
We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial governments to work with Aboriginal communities to provide culturally relevant services to inmates on issues such as substance abuse, family and domestic violence, and overcoming the experience of having been sexually abused.
We call on caller number 37, Ron Corstein.
We call upon the federal government to provide more supports for Aboriginal programming in halfway houses and parole services.
We call on caller number 38, Robin Pronto.
We call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to commit to eliminating the overrepresentation of Aboriginal youth in custody over the next decade.
We call on caller number 39, Sarah Hennessy.
We call upon the federal government to develop a national plan to collect and publish data on the criminal victimization of Aboriginal people, including data related to homicide and family violence victimization.
We call on caller number 40, Sela Khan. We call on all levels of government in collaboration with Aboriginal people to create adequately funded and accessible Aboriginal specific victim programs and services with appropriate evaluation mechanisms. We call on caller number 41, Durka Prout.
We call upon the federal government in consultation with Aboriginal organizations to appoint a public inquiry into the causes of and remedies for the disproportionate victimization of Aboriginal women and girls. The inquiry's mandate would include 1, investigation into missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. 2, links to the intergenerational legacy of residential schools.
We call on caller number 42, Carol Hunsberger.
We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to commit to the recognition and implementation of Aboriginal justice systems in a manner consistent with the Treaty and Aboriginal Rights of Aboriginal Peoples, the Constitution Act 1982, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, endorsed by Canada in November 2012.
We call on caller number 43, Josh Morgan.
We call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework for reconciliation.
We call on caller number 44, Jocelyn Wheely.
We call upon the Government of Canada to develop a national action plan, strategies, and other concrete measures to achieve the goals of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
We call on caller number 45, Donna Maynard.
We call upon the Government of Canada on behalf of all Canadians to jointly develop with Aboriginal peoples a Royal Proclamation of Reconciliation to be issued by the Crown. The proclamation would build on the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara of 1764 and reaffirm the nation-to-nation relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the Crown. The proclamation would include, but not be limited to, the following commitments. 1, repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. Adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation. Renew or establish the treaty relationships based on principles of mutual recognition, mutual respect, and shared responsibility for maintaining those relationships into the future. Reconcile Aboriginal and Crown constitutional and legal orders to ensure that Aboriginal peoples are full partners in Confederation, including the recognition and integration of Indigenous laws and legal traditions in negotiation and implementation processes involving treaties, land claims, and other constructive agreements.
We call on caller number 46, Joe Henry.
We call upon the parties to the Indigenous Residential Schools Settlement Agreement to develop and sign a covenant of reconciliation that would identify the principles for working collaboratively to advance reconciliation in Canadian society. And that would include, but not be limited to, 1, reaffirmation of the parties' commitments to reconciliation. 2, repudiation of the concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and the reformation of laws, governance structures, and policies within their respective institutions that continue to rely on such concepts. 3, full adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation. 4, support the renewal or establishment of treaty relationships based on the principles of mutual recognition, mutual respect, shared responsibility for maintaining those relationships into the future. 5, enabling those excluded from the settlement agreement to sign onto the covenant of reconciliation. And 6, enabling additional parties to sign onto the covenant of reconciliation.
We call on caller number 47, Nick LaMarche.
We call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous people and lands, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and to reform those laws, government policies, and litigation strategies that continue to rely on such concepts.
We call on caller 48, Jules Kcato.
We call upon the church parties to the settlement agreement and all other faith groups and interfaith social justice groups in Canada who have not already done so to formally adopt and comply with the principles, norms, and standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation. This would include, but not be limited to, the following commitments. 1. Ensuring that their institutions, policies, programs, and practices comply with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. 2. Respecting Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination in spiritual matters, including the right to practice, develop, and teach their own spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies, consistent with Article 12.1 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. 3. Engaging in ongoing public dialogue and actions to support the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. 4. Issuing a statement no later than March 31st, 2016, from all religious denominations and faith groups as to how they will implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
We call on caller 49, Russell de Vernoy. Alexa McCoy.
I'm here. Oh.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. We call upon all religious denominations and faith groups who have not already done so to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over indigenous lands and peoples, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius.
We call on caller 50, Siobhan Waters.
In keeping with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we call upon the federal government, in collaboration with Aboriginal organizations, to fund the establishment of Indigenous law institutes for the development, use, and understanding of Indigenous laws and access to justice in accordance with the unique cultures of Aboriginal peoples in Canada.
We call on caller 51, Samantha Pearson.
We call upon the Government of Canada, as an obligation of its fiduciary responsibility, to develop a policy of transparency by publishing legal opinions it develops and upon which it acts or intends to act in regard to the scope and extent of Aboriginal and treaty rights.
We call on caller 52, Adam Taylor.
We call upon the governments of Canada, provincial and territorial governments, and the courts to adopt the following legal principles. Aboriginal title claims are accepted once the Aboriginal claimant has established occupation over a particular territory at a particular point in time. And once Aboriginal title has been established, the burden of proving any limitation on any rights arising from the existence of that title shifts to the party asserting such a limitation.
We call on caller 53, Peggy Sattler.
We call upon the Parliament of Canada, in consultation and collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, to enact legislation to establish a National Council for Reconciliation. The legislation would establish the council as an independent national oversight body with membership jointly appointed by the Government of Canada and national Aboriginal organizations, and consisting of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal members. Its mandate would include, but not be limited to, the following. 1. Monitor, evaluate, and report annually to Parliament and the people of Canada on the Government of Canada's post-apology progress on reconciliation to ensure that government accountability for reconciling the relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the Crown is maintained in the coming years. 2. Monitor, evaluate, and report to Parliament and the people of Canada on reconciliation progress across all levels and sectors of Canadian society, including the implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action. 3. Develop and implement a multi-year national action plan for reconciliation, which includes research and policy development public education programs and resources. 4, promote public dialogue, public-private partnerships, and public initiatives for reconciliation.
We call on caller 54, Cheryl Ruth.
We call upon the Government of Canada to provide multi-year funding for the National Council of Reconciliation to ensure that it has the financial, human, and technical resources required to conduct its work, including the endowment of a National Reconciliation Trust to advance the cause of reconciliation.
We call on caller 55, Teresa Armstrong.
We call upon all levels of government to provide annual reports or any current data requested by the National Council for Reconciliation so that it can report on the progress towards reconciliation. The reports or data would include, but not limited to, the number of Aboriginal, including Métis and Inuit children in care, compared with non-Aboriginal children, the reasons for apprehension, and the total spending on preventative and care services by child welfare agencies. 2, comparative funding for education of First Nations children on and off reserves. 3, the education and income attainments of Aboriginal people in Canada compared with non-Aboriginal people. 4, progress on closing the gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities in a number of health indicators such as infant mortality, maternal health, suicide, mental health, addictions, life expectancy, birth rates, infant and child health issues, chronic diseases, illness and injury incidents, and the availability of appropriate health services. 5, progress on eliminating the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in youth custody over the next decade. 6, progress on reducing the rate of criminal victimization of Aboriginal people, including data related to homicide and family violence, victimization, and other crimes. 7, progress on reducing the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in justice and correctional systems.
We call on caller 56, Emma Richard.
We call upon the Prime Minister of Canada to formally respond to the report of the National Council for Reconciliation by issuing an annual State of Aboriginal Peoples report, which would outline the government's plans for advancing the cause of reconciliation.
We call on caller 57, Meg Brothwick.
We call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to provide education to public servants on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skill-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism.
Thank you. Before we move to the second caller, could we just ask that the readers just slow down slightly for the interpreters? Thank you. We call on caller 58, Jim Peshaud.
We call upon the Pope to issue an apology to survivors, their families, and communities for the Roman Catholic Church's role in the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in the Catholic-run residential schools. We call for that apology to be similar to the 2010 apology issued to Irish victims of abuse, and to occur within 1 year of the issuing of this report, and to be delivered by the Pope in Canada.
We call on caller 59, Carolyn Ciao.
We call upon church parties to the settlement agreement to develop ongoing education strategies to ensure that their respective congregations learn about their church's role in colonization, the history and legacy of residential schools, and why apologies to former residential school students, their families, and communities were necessary.
We call on caller 60, Mark Jensen.
We call upon leaders of the church parties to the settlement agreement and all other faiths, in collaboration with Indigenous spiritual leaders, survivors, schools of theology, seminaries, and other religious training centers, to develop and teach curriculum for all student clergy and all clergy and staff who work in Aboriginal communities, on the need to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right, the history and legacy of residential schools, and the roles of the church parties in that system, the history and legacy of religious conflict in Aboriginal families and communities, and the responsibility that churches have to mitigate such conflicts and prevent spiritual violence.
We call on caller 61, Maya Wilson.
We call upon church parties to the settlement agreement in collaboration with survivors and representatives of Aboriginal organizations. 1, community-controlled healing and reconciliation projects. 2, community-controlled cultural and language revitalization projects. 3, controlled education and relationship building projects. 4, regional dialogues for Indigenous spiritual leaders and youth to discuss Indigenous spirituality, self-determination, and reconciliation.
We call on caller 62, Dave Malloy.
We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments in consultation and collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal peoples, and educators to 1, make age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal peoples' historical and contemporary contributions to Canada, a mandatory educational requirement for kindergarten to grade 12 students. 2, provide the necessary funding to post-secondary institutions to educate teachers on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods into classrooms. 3, provide the necessary funding to Aboriginal schools to utilize Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in classrooms. And 4, establish senior level positions in government at the Assistant Deputy Minister level or higher, dedicated to Aboriginal content in education.
We call on caller 63, Céline Poyer.
Je vais lire cet appel à l'action en français afin de reconnaître la relation entre les peuples autochtones de ce territoire et le peuple francophone depuis de nombreux siècles, avant même l'établissement de la nation canadienne. I will read this call to action in French to recognize the relationship between the peoples of this territory, the original peoples of this territory, and the Francophone people for numerous centuries before even the establishment of the nation of Canada. Nous demandons au Conseil des ministres de l'Éducation Canada de maintenir un engagement annuel à l'égard des questions relatives à l'éducation des Autochtones, notamment en ce qui touche l'élaboration et la mise en œuvre de la maternelle à la 12e année de programmes d'études et de ressources d'apprentissage sur les peuples autochtones dans l'histoire du Canada et sur l'histoire et les séquelles des pensionnats. 2, la mise en commun de renseignements et de pratiques exemplaires en ce qui a trait au programme d'enseignement lié aux pensionnats et à l'histoire des Autochtones. 3, le renforcement de la compréhension interculturelle, de l'empathie et du respect mutuel. 4. L'évaluation des besoins de formation des enseignants relativement à ce qui précède.
We call on caller 64, Andrew Jardin.
We call upon all levels of government that provide public funds to denominational schools to require such schools to provide an education on comparative religious studies, which must include a segment on Aboriginal spiritual beliefs and practices developed in collaboration with Aboriginal elders.
We call on caller 65, Jillian Belfour.
We call upon the federal government through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, post-secondary institutions and educators, and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation and its partner institutions to establish a national research program with multi-level funding to advance understanding of reconciliation.
We call on caller 66, Lorraine McNeil.
We call upon the federal government to establish multi-year funding for community-based youth organizations to deliver programs on reconciliation and establish a national network to share information and best practices.
We call on caller 67, Jeff Hanks. If Jeff Hanks is not there, we can call on Alexa McCoy.
We call upon the federal government to provide funding to the Canadian Museums Association to undertake, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, a national review of museum policies and best practices to determine the level of compliance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to make recommendations.
Thank you. We call on caller 68, Betsy Ogard.
We call upon the federal government in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples and the Canadian Museums Association to mark the 150th anniversary of Canadian Confederation in 2017 by establishing a dedicated national funding program for commemoration projects on the theme of reconciliation.
We call on caller 69, Adrian Coder.
We call upon Library and Archives Canada to 1. Fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the United Nations Joint Aren't-Liker Principles as related to Aboriginal peoples' inalienable right to know the truth about what happened and why, with regard to human rights violations committed against them in the residential schools. 2. Ensure that its record holdings related to residential schools are accessible to the public. And 3. Commit more resources to its public education materials and programming on residential schools.
We call on caller 70, Martha Gordon.
We call upon the federal government to provide funding to the Canadian Association of Archivists to undertake, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, a national review of archival policies and best practices to 1. Determine the level of compliance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the United Nations Joint Aren't-Liker Principles as related to Aboriginal people's inalienable right to know the truth about what happened and why, with regard to the human rights violations committed against them in the residential schools. And 2, produce a report with recommendations for full implementation of these international mechanisms as a reconciliation framework for Canadian archives.
We call on caller 71, Carrie Arnold.
We call upon all chief coroners and provincial vital statistics agencies that have not provided to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada their records on the deaths of Aboriginal children in the care of residential school authorities to make these documents available to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation.
We call on caller 72, Sherry Smith.
We call upon the federal government to allocate sufficient resources to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to allow it to develop and maintain the National Residential School Student Death Register established by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada.
We call on caller 73, John Hang.
We call upon the federal government to work with churches, Aboriginal communities, and former residential school students to establish and maintain an online registry of residential school cemeteries, including, where possible, plot maps showing the location of deceased residential school children.
We call on call number 74, Nabila Gannett.
We call upon the federal government to work with the churches and Aboriginal community leaders to inform the families of children who died at residential schools of the child burial location and to respond to families' wishes for appropriate commemoration ceremonies and markers and reburial in home communities where requested.
We call on caller 75, Lisa McLean.
We call upon the federal government to work with provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, churches, Aboriginal communities, former residential school students, and current landowners to develop and implement strategies and procedures for the ongoing identification, documentation, maintenance, commemoration, and protection of residential school cemeteries or other sites at which residential school children were buried. This is to include the provision of appropriate memorial ceremonies and commemorative markers to honor the deceased children.
We call on caller number 76, Sherry Henderson.
We call upon the parties engaged in the work of documenting, maintaining, commemorating, and protecting residential school cemeteries to adopt strategies in accordance with the following principles. 1, the Aboriginal community most affected shall lead the development of such strategies. 2, information shall be sought from residential school survivors and other knowledge keepers in the development of such strategies. And 3, Aboriginal protocols shall be respected before any potentially invasive technical inspection and investigation of a cemetery site.
We call on caller number 77, Monica Sass.
We call upon provincial, territorial, municipal, and community archives to work collaboratively with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to identify and collect copies of all records relevant to the history and legacy of the residential school system, and to provide these to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation.
We call on caller 78, Maria Chavez.
We call upon the Government of Canada to commit to making a funding contribution of $10 million over 7 years to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation plus an additional amount to assist communities to research and produce histories of their own residential school experience and their involvement in truth, healing, and reconciliation.
We call on caller 79, Zoe Hay Jones.
We call upon the federal government, in collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal organizations, and the arts community, to develop a reconciliation framework for Canadian heritage and commemoration. This would include, but not be limited to, 1, amending the Historic Sites and Monuments Act to include First Nations, Inuit, and Métis representation on the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada and its Secretariat. 2, revising the policies, criteria, and practices of the National Program of Historical Commemoration to integrate Indigenous history, heritage values, and memory practices into Canada's national heritage and history. 3, developing and implementing a national heritage plan and strategy for commemorating residential school sites, the history and legacy of residential schools, and the contributions of Aboriginal peoples to Canada's history.
We call on caller 80, Ellie Kozak.
We call upon the federal government, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, to establish a statutory holiday, a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, to honor survivors, their families, and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process.
We call on caller 81, Krista Lysak.
We call upon the federal government, in collaboration with survivors and their organizations and other parties to the settlement agreement, to commission and install publicly accessible, highly visible residential schools national monument in the city of Ottawa, to honor survivors and all the children who were lost, to their families and communities.
We call on caller 82, Jordan Fairbairn.
We call upon provincial and territorial governments, in collaboration with survivors and their organizations and other parties to the settlement agreement, to commission and install a publicly accessible, highly visible residential schools monument in each capital city to honor survivors and all the children who were lost to their families and communities.
We call on caller 83, Shondell Maxwell.
We call upon the Canada Council for the Arts to establish, as a funding priority, a strategy for Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists to undertake collaborative projects that produce works that contribute to the reconciliation process.
We call on caller 84, Rob McNeil.
We call upon the federal government to restore and increase funding to the CBC Radio Canada to enable Canada's national public broadcaster to support reconciliation and be properly reflective of the diverse cultures, languages, and perspectives of Aboriginal peoples, including but not limited to: 1, increasing Aboriginal programming, including Aboriginal language speakers. 2, increasing equitable access for Aboriginal peoples to jobs, leadership positions, and professional development opportunities within the organisation. 3, continuing to provide dedicated news coverage and online public information resources on issues of concern to Aboriginal peoples and all Canadians, including the history and legacy of residential schools and the reconciliation process.
We call on caller 85, Katie Pitcher. If Denise Cook would like to go, or Christy Brichette.
Hi, it's Christy. Call 85. We call upon the Aboriginal People's Television Network as an independent, nonprofit broadcaster with programming by, for, and about Aboriginal peoples to support reconciliation, including, but not limited to, 1. Continuing to provide leadership in programming and organizational culture that reflects the diverse cultures, languages, and perspectives of Aboriginal peoples. And 2, continuing to develop media initiatives that inform and educate the Canadian public and connect Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians.
Thank you, Christy. We call on caller 86, Jane Anatoniak.
We call upon Canadian journalism programs and media schools to require education for all students on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties, and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations.
We call on caller 87, Shailin Chow. Alexa McCoy.
'87. We call upon all levels of government in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, sports halls of fame, and other relevant organizations to provide public education that tells the national story of Aboriginal athletes in history.
We call on caller 88, Tiffany and Lila Serreris.
We call upon all levels of government to take action to ensure long-term Aboriginal athlete development and growth and continued support for the North American Indigenous Games, including funding to host the Games and for provincial and territorial team preparation and travel.
We call on caller 89, Rashika Mohammed.
We call upon the federal government to amend the Physical Activity in Sport Act to support reconciliation by ensuring that policies to promote physical activity as a fundamental element of health and well-being, reduce barriers to support sports participation, increase the pursuit of excellence in sport, and build capacity in the Canadian sports system, are inclusive of Aboriginal peoples.
We call on caller 90, Brian Smith.
Call upon the federal government to ensure that national sports policies, programs, and initiatives are inclusive of Aboriginal peoples, including but not limited to establishing, 1, in collaboration with provincial and territorial governments, stable funding for and access to community sports programs that reflect the diverse cultures and traditional sporting activities of Aboriginal peoples. 2, an elite athlete development program for Aboriginal athletes. 3, programs for coaches, trainers, and sports officials that are culturally relevant for Aboriginal peoples. And 4, anti-racism awareness and training programs.
We call on caller 91, Kathleen Brandt.
We call upon the officials in host countries of international sporting events, such as the Olympics, Pan Am, and Commonwealth Games, to ensure that Indigenous peoples' territorial protocols are respected and local Indigenous communities are engaged in all aspects of planning and participating in such events.
We call on caller 92, Amanda Leibau.
Number 92.
we call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous people and their lands and resources. This would include, but not be limited to, the following: commitment to meaningful consultation, building respect, relationship, and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. Number two, ensure that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Aboriginal communities gain long-term sustainability benefits from economic development projects. And finally, provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. And finally, this will require skill-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism.
We call on caller 93, Rick Ogard.
We call upon the federal government, in collaboration with the national Aboriginal organizations, to revise the information kit for newcomers to Canada and its citizenship test to reflect a more inclusive history of the diverse Aboriginal peoples of Canada, including information about the treaties and the history of residential schools.
We call on caller 94, Michelle Baldwin.
We call upon the Government of Canada to replace the oath of citizenship with the following: I swear or affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors, and that I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including treaties with Indigenous peoples, and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was incredible, very moving, and I hope that many of you have learned something as you have listened or read the calls. We are now going to share a music video as a time for reflection. It was written and performed by Logan Statz, a member of the Mohawk First Nation. Logan was born on Six Nations of the Grand River Territory and was raised in the nearby town of Brantford, Ontario. Stat's song, Dead Man, that you are about to listen to is a tribute to the experiences of Indigenous people and culture under the experience of colonialism. Please take this time to reflect and write, either privately or in the group chat, specific actions that you will commit to doing to further the process of reconciliation.
Sego, my name is Logan Statz. I'm a singer-songwriter from Six Nations. My ancestors attended the residential school in Brantford, known as the Mohawk Institute. This song is part of their story. It's part of my story. And y'all will go for listening.
Dig up my bones, carry my body home, and I'll buy back my soul with the gold that I'm owed. 'Cause I've been the dead man, just walking away, 'Cause I've been the dead man, just walking away. And I think she's had enough. thrill of your thrills. Better put down the pills before she heads for the hills. 'Cause I've been a dead man, just walking away, just walking away. 'Cause I've been a dead man, just walking away, just walking away. And give me back my love. And I think she's had enough. And give me back my love. And I think she's had enough. So have I. 'Cause I've been a dead man, just walking away, just walking away. 'Cause I've been a dead man, just walking away. And give me back my love, walking away. And I think she's had enough. And give me back my love, walking away. And I think she's had enough, walking away. So am I.
As you finish up your thoughts and sit with the message of the song and video, Dr. Jillian Balforth, the Academic Vice President and Dean of King's University College, will give some closing remarks.
Thank you. So many things to reflect on this evening, and a time to be quiet and reflect. So higher education across Turtle Island occupies unceded territory. We are implicated in both the causes of colonial harm, as well as the responsibility to find a path towards reconciliation. Our obligations as universities are clear: to return to the TRC time and time again to affirm what we must do to address ongoing harms of genocide of Indigenous peoples. Our research and teaching must seek truth of historical and ongoing colonialism. Thank you to SJPS students who visioned this event for us here tonight at a time when we needed it most to be reminded of what matters, when everything seems to be defeating us at the moment in our need to be together. Thank you too to this community for finding time to be here, to hear your voice say these 95 calls to actions. Be well.
Just before we conclude, I would like to thank all of the readers and guest speakers who participated in our event. I would also like to thank the team who organized this event: Laura Crow, Krista Malone, Jennifer Serreris, Shauna Lukowitz, and Allison Larkin. A very special thanks to Corey Cook, our IT specialist, who put together the webinar, and to our ASL interpreters, Angela Kaur and Janice Johnson. Miigwech and Yoko. Peace and health to all. Good evening.